The Hudson Library and Historical Society presents art historian Felicia Zavarella Stadelman, speaking about award-winning American photojournalist Steve McCurry, whose spectacular photography and harrowing photojournalist life will astound you. His most famous work includes this spellbinding photo named the Afghan Girl, a photo that became one of the most famous covers of National Geographic magazine. Recorded at the Hudson Library's Flood Meeting Room on January 30th, 2017.
Good evening and welcome to the Hudson Library. It's nice to see so many faces out tonight on a snowy day. It's nice to see how many art enthusiasts we have in our community. I think a lot of Felicia fanatics. I'd like to welcome you, please, to join us. We have a lot of upcoming programs. This week we have the author Tracy Chevalier coming on Wednesday, February 1st. That will be an interesting program. Let me welcome back our beloved speaker tonight. Ms. Felicia Zavarella Stadelman is our local art historian. She has been enriching our lives with the stories of the great artists here at the library for the past 3 years. Tonight I think we're in for a real treat because we've learned about so many different artists. Tonight we're going to learn about a photographer, Steve McCurry. So if you could please join me in welcoming her. Please welcome Felicia Zavarella Stadelman.
Hello, I've missed you. And I have to tell you, I have a little lump in my throat because this is our last lecture here. So we've been doing it for 3 years, and I've seen all of your faces many times over the years as we've grown and added more lectures. And so I'm a little sad to say goodbye, but hopefully we'll find some other way to get back here and talk about maybe some other new artists that I could find that have as interesting of a story. That's the challenge, is to not put you to sleep so that you say, yeah, I kind of slept during Felicia's. Anyway, I don't think you'll be sleeping during this one. Steve McCurry, I don't do this for all of my groups because he's a photographer and his work is challenging, and I just felt that the audience that I have here would definitely appreciate who he is. His career was launched when, wearing native costume, he crossed the Pakistan border into rebel-controlled Afghanistan just before the Russian invasion. And when he emerged, he had rolls of film sewn into the hems of his pants that contained some of the world's first images of the conflict. And his coverage won the Robert Capa Gold Medal for Best Photographic Reporting from Abroad, showing courage and enterprise. He's won numerous awards, including the National Press Photographers Association Award, the Magazine Photographer of the Year Award, 4 first prizes in the World Press Photo Contest, which is very significant to even get 1, and he's gotten 4. So his work has been featured in magazines around the globe, and his reportage for National Geographic has included photos from many different nations. He is the cameraman who is celebrated for his ability to be inconspicuously candid, which has taken him to spots all over the world. He's there, but he's not really there. He has a knack for remaining a candid cameraman that nobody really notices. It's a beautiful moment, the kind that lets those of us who are too busy to notice pause for a moment and see who we really are. He's a master infiltrator of the human condition. He has a way of finding us in them. And he's helped to make a world stop with his photographs, and because he's emerged as a premier hotspot shooter in the late 70s. Now, slipping over the border into rebel-held Afghanistan in 1979, he was only able to do that disguised as a tribesman. He was one of the first to capture the scenes of that epic tragedy. And his powerful image of the innocents caught up in the conflict were published all around the world for Time, Newsweek, Life, and a number of different publications, including the one that he's most associated with, National Geographic. He has shot 18 different stories for National Geographic, including 7 different covers. His frontline work in Afghanistan and other dangerous places around the world has won him a reputation as being one of the hardest core of all the troubleshooter cameramen. He's been arrested in Pakistan and Burma. He's been mortared and shot at and robbed in Afghanistan, beaten up and nearly drowned in India, and almost killed in a plane crash in Bosnia. Yet through it all, he's managed to come back with photos that speak of dignity and humanity, even when he's in places that seems devoid of it. Now, I had the opportunity to talk to Steve McCurry in February of 2010. He was in Canton. I don't know if anybody had a chance to see his exhibit, but I had a left nerve to give his agent, I guess, a call, or his manager, and say, you know, I do these lectures, I'm thinking of putting him in my series, can I just have 20 minutes with him? And he very graciously granted it for me. And then at the Malone University, he was speaking, and a number of us, there were about 20 in the room, were allowed to ask him additional questions. So all of the information that's in this presentation is from conversations that I've had either one-on-one or with other people who've also asked questions of Steve McCurry. He was born February 24th, 1950, in a small town called Newton Square, Pennsylvania. He was an extremely active, very rebellious child. He grew up thinking that life was a little too bland. And his traveling, incidentally, predates his photography. After high school, he went to live in Europe for a year. He said, I did some traveling a little bit in Europe, in the Mideast, Africa, Central America, and I had the feeling that I could have been a gypsy. I had that gypsy existence, and that's what led me to photography, was the fact that he wanted to travel. He attended Marple Newton High School in Delaware County, and afterwards he went to Penn State University. And although his experience in visuals first led him to get a degree in cinematography, it was while he was studying that he started taking photos for the college newspaper just to make a little money, the Daily Collegian, I think it was called, and he was hooked. So he continued in photojournalism, but still majored in cinematography. He said, when I was at Penn State, I started out studying film history, cinematography, and went from that into filmmaking, graduated with a degree in theater arts. While I was in filmmaking, I started doing a lot of still photography and working for the school newspaper, and drifted into doing stills for films. I started looking at a lot of photography books, Dorothea Lange, for example, Walker Evans. And once I got out of school, I never got involved in my master's in filmmaking and what he majored in at all. He graduated magna cum laude, incidentally, in 1974. After graduation, he went to work for Today's Post in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, and he worked there for 2 years. He saved a little bit of money, and he was drawn to the possibility of traveling a little bit, and India was something that interested him. And it proved to be a pivotal experience because of the diversity of color, he said, the life, and his 6-week trip that he had saved enough money for and planned turned into a 2-year adventure. He said, I'd figured I'd go to the new part of the world where I hadn't been before, and I was planning on spending 3 months in India. Then I was going to Cyprus or Turkey, but I ended up spending 2 years in India without ever coming back. He said, I had a fair amount of money, about $9,000, and when you live on $5 a day in India, that goes pretty far. I was able to survive for about 2 years. There was an occasional small magazine story, but when I got to Afghanistan, I got into the major league magazines. So he traveled throughout the subcontinent, exploring India, Nepal, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and he was contacted by National Geographic magazine for his first assignment. And they asked him if he could go into Baluchistan, which is in Pakistan, and he assured them that he could, although he had no idea if he could or not. After he had lunch, he said, I don't think I made a very good impression, and he didn't think he was going to get the job. They ended up giving him the assignment and another story to cover the Pakistani tribe called the Kalash. Now, he ended up spending 6 months working on this Baluchistan story, and eventually the editors killed it because he said the text wasn't very good. He wasn't a good writer. He said, I'd been put in jail with my guide for that story, and after the first night, the guard put the guide and I in leg irons and connected us to a column. He said, I was certain that they were going to deport me. I was really depressed because I thought I had blown my career with National Geographic, but apart from that, I was thinking, how am I going to get out of here? It could be weeks or it could be months. Maybe they're going to make an example of me here indefinitely. And he said they weren't feeding us. We had to give money to the guards in the prison staff just to give us pieces of cookies. But after 4 days, they let him go without any explanation. He has no idea why or who got involved. He said they didn't deport us, so we went right back to work. Then National Geographic killed the article, and they did use the Kalash story, and I did another one, and then it's been over 20 years of working with National Geographic after that first experience. He said the experience prepared him for major assignments with National Geographic that soon followed, and he then reported for 7 months this Russian invasion of Afghanistan. When he was in Pakistan in '79, he was just wandering around doing odd jobs and magazine assignments for small magazines, and he met a few Afghan refugees in a small village called Shatral in northern Pakistan, and they told him that their villages were being destroyed and they wanted him to help them get the word out. So they smuggled him into Afghanistan with the hopes that he would be able to give them some kind of press coverage. He said it was an amazing experience being under mortar fire, machine gun fire, visiting all these people whose villages had been destroyed. And it was the first time that I got involved with the major magazines like Time and Newsweek. There was a lot of fear going on during this civil war. There was a lot of fear just in leaving Pakistan in disguise and going into another country, he said. And he was crossing an international border without a passport, going into forbidden areas and then into a war zone. He said it was do you see him in the photo down there in the center? And you saw him in the other photos there, I think. He said it was absolutely frightening when they were lobbing mortar rounds into the area that could land anywhere at any time because they're not particularly accurate. You know you could be history at any minute. Then after about 5 days, he said, I started to get a little more confidence because I wasn't hit. He said there were times when he was there that he figured as long as he had gotten himself into the situation, the time to bail out would have been when he had the disguise going and crossed the border and not now. He said now I had work to do and I wasn't going to back down. Once I'd spent a couple of weeks there, I took a bunch of pictures. I had success getting them published in the New York Times and Time Magazine, and I went back 10 times over the next 2 years. So what drew him over the border in the first place? What was on the other side that he was willing to risk his life for? That was one of my questions. He said, I was trying to make the transition from being a news photographer in Philadelphia and becoming a magazine photographer. I quit my newspaper job to work in India, and the newspaper job got very repetitive. We had a huge area in suburban Philadelphia. We'd have to do 5 or 10 high school graduations in a season, the Lions, the Kiwanis Club, the Ladies Club. He said, I decided this isn't the way I want to spend my life. So I saved my money, quit, and went to India. And I'd been reading about the Afghan situation in the newspaper, and it seemed important, although I wasn't sure why. They were really scared and nervous and worried about the future of their country. I knew that. So he says there's a sense when you're surrounded daily by war that you get used to it and you actually become less fearful. He said one bomb in Afghanistan landed about 30 feet from my room, blew all the windows out of the room and the wooden frames and the windows, everything. And then another time a mortar round went off about 15 feet from where I was. After this happened to you 1 or 2 times and you walk away, you start to feel like maybe my number's not up. The impact on him personally resulted in all of these dramatic faces, these conflicts. The people he realized are pretty much the same, but they just happen to wear different costumes, have different architecture, and they eat different food. He said, but we're basically pretty much all the same. Tribesmen in the Sahara fundamentally are not that different from someone in Hong Kong, for example. He said they have different clothes and religions, but they all laugh at the same jokes. They're sad and their families have to work and nobody wants to go to work. He said the same thing strikes everybody funny, which he found very interesting. Basically, he said, I went out to search for difference and I came back celebrating the universal. Everybody wants to be respected, it said, to have a sense, he said that, to have a sense that you're just trying to understand their culture. He said a taxi driver who rips you off, whether it's in New York or India, it's the same dynamic. He said if you're clowning around with some people in Burma, they respond the same way that they would in Guatemala. He said it's the damnedest thing. He said for women, though, of course it's different, and that's hard to deal with. He said, but in Yemen, under that veil, they're wearing designer clothes. He seems to tell stories more than other photographers do, and he's often asked, what are you trying to communicate with the viewer in these photos? He said, the first thing to me is the human aspect of the picture, to try to convey some sort of empathy with the subject, and secondly, the composition and the form and how the picture's put together. But primarily, I want the message of who they are. I like to have the photo communicate what it's like to be that person. And I want to have some sort of insight into the human condition of that subject. That's the most interesting part of my work, as opposed to something which is about composition and form and color. He said, I like color photography, but when the picture's just about color, I don't think it goes very far. I think it really needs to say something about a person, give some insight into their life, or tell me how their life is different from mine. Now, most of what has come out of his pictures in the third world countries would be the fact that he's very conspicuous to his subjects. Maybe his subjects are self-conscious of the camera. So what's the secret, someone asked him, of taking candid pictures in all of these places? He said, eventually people get to be bored of me. A lot of it is just having the patience to wait it out, because there's an initial period when people are curious and they crowd around, and eventually they see that I'm not really doing anything very interesting and they walk away. Part of it is just being patient and waiting until people decide to look somewhere else or just get bored with you. He said then there's the other thing of when you go into a village and there's crowds of kids around, sometimes you work really fast in the beginning and you get something. Sometimes there's crowds all around me, but you don't see that in the picture. Sometimes there's 10 or 20 people following me around, and I think I'm just being very persistent. 80% of your time isn't productive, but if a couple of times in the course of the day you get what you need, then that's good enough. He said, I like pictures to be technique-less. For the most part, he shoots with one lens, available light. He likes to be close to his subjects. He's a master of light and humanity, he said. Even though his portraits of people and places are beautiful, and sometimes he's in the middle of a catastrophe, he kind of comes at it sideways, he said, and then he renders this striking but not overly picturesque photo. India was the first place where he really started working intently, and it was so different from how he grew up. He said there's an extreme range of class and caste, the rich and the poor, and the people tend to live their lives right out in the street. Whereas in the US, people tend to do everything indoors. There's just this fascination of life. Sometimes it's shocking, but it's always interesting. You never get bored. If I walk down the street in Cleveland, I feel like it's very familiar. I've seen it before. It doesn't intrigue me. But India, there's a more intense experience. So what's his approach when he goes into hotspots like Afghanistan? He said the key is that you need to go a bit slow, try to get a good understanding of the situation, and then you need a really good local person who can give you a sense of the realities of where you are. You can go into problematic places or situations you don't want to be in, and you've got to trust the person who's showing you around to know where you need to avoid. He said, I usually don't stay in a village very long. In a place like Kashmir, for example, he said, I never stay overnight, and I always come unannounced. I never tell my driver how long I'm going to be there, when I'm going to arrive, or when I'm going to leave. I don't tell him where I'm going until it's time to leave, because I really don't trust anybody except for one particular person. This is his one person that he always trusted, who was a guide for him. He said it's a combination of your own intuition and gut feeling, and you rely on the local person to give you good advice. He's often asked about the war zones. How does he deal with the situations that go wrong there? And he said, they broke into my hotel room once in Kabul at 2 a.m, and I was the only guest in the hotel. This was during the pre-Taliban fighting in 1992. And they started knocking on the door, and I turned the light on and got dressed and started saying, UN, UN, UN. Then they went over to the window, and he went over to the window, and he noticed that there was a guy cutting right through the screen with a knife. He had a bandana over his face, which was kind of a giveaway that he was in trouble. He said the other problem was that there was a lot of celebration fire going on outside because it was just after they had taken over the city. So there was a lot of gunfire, and he said, if these guys shoot me, nobody's going to hear this, and it's not going to mean anything to anyone. He said, so I just opened the door and I let him in. I figured if I piss these guys off, he said, then they're going to think that I'm a problem and they'll shoot me. So he went into the bathroom. They went through all of his stuff like it was a rummage sale. He said, fortunately, he always had his cameras safely tucked away under the carpet, under the bed. And his money and his passport were also there. So they wound up leaving without hurting him. So he's been shot at, robbed, nearly drowned. So what's the lure of this danger for McCurry? He said, I've twice been reported dead, and that kind of affects your trust in people. He said, I put my faith in this guy in Thailand once. We were in a remote village. He stole all of my equipment, and then he took the train straight back down to Bangkok. Unlucky for him, I took the same train. And it was only when we both got off the train that we noticed each other. He went into the police station and handed everything over to me. He said, in Afghanistan, it was a story that he had been following since 1979. He said, one of the things that interests me most is the amazing drama. In the beginning of this invasion force, the Soviets were trying to take over, and the people were trying to keep their nation from being swallowed up. And it was a noble cause, but it was overwhelming odds. And certainly the human drama, he said, is overwhelming. The stakes are so high, and it's like life, I imagine, during the Civil War or Revolutionary War. And there's something about these monumental moments in a country's existence when things that we're normally preoccupied with, like career and family, it all becomes secondary to this larger freedom or struggle. In the case of Afghanistan, it was just survival. And how people react and how that human spirit can either wither or be resilient is a very fascinating thing that he captures. So how many rolls of film does he shoot for a Geographic story, and how many shots does he use to get the piece? I asked him. He said about 500 rolls of film. And then I select maybe 20 or 30 shots out of that. And he said, it's not that the other ones aren't good. The other ones are usable and probably will be published other times. But when I'm working with National Geographic, I spend more time on the story. By the time he leaves the place, he feels like he knows it pretty well. He said one of the most interesting locations was Burma. He said it was a country that was in a time warp. You feel like you're back in the 40s or the 50s. The military government there assigned 2 escorts to travel with him virtually everywhere to make sure that he didn't photograph things that would show the country unfavorably, like soldiers forced into labor scenes, which was quite widespread. He said they didn't want us coming back with any pictures that showed people with these leg irons on. They did stop him twice. Once at a place where there was forced labor going on, and he did capture a few photos. He said, but I was able to go back on my own, and I photographed prisoners dredging around a moat, around a palace, living in the most squalid conditions. He said there were hundreds of these guys, like ants, with soldiers watching over them to make sure they did their work, and they didn't like us photographing that, so they arrested me. When he first gets to a new city or country, he said, I spend some time just looking around, finding out what's unique or special about the place that's different from anywhere else in the world. He said, when I travel, I look just like a tourist. I wear khaki trousers, a jacket. I have a Nikon swinging from my shoulder, generally a baseball cap on my head. It's really an interesting outfit for a man who has risked his life to go to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Burma, and China. He said, you need to be sharp and you need to be careful, especially now. You can get killed over if you put a foot in the wrong place in Kabul, for example. And he relies a lot on getting to know the locals. He said, I've never had an ear for language, so I rely on them to tell me what's going on. He tries to find the special nature of a place. He said, if it's Yemen, for example, I might want to look through different villages and find out which one is the most interesting, which one is the most appealing, which one has the best example of architecture. I might go through 5 or 10 villages and say, okay, this looks interesting. And once I find what makes a place tick, then I delve into it photographically. But he said, in the beginning, I'm just surveying. So what kind of opportunities does he look for? He might go back to a place several times. He said a lot of times he just parks himself on a street corner and he just waits for things to happen. He said there's a certain romance about being associated as a foreign correspondent and having this expatriate life. So what's the best and what's the worst? I had to ask him, what's it really like out there? And he said, I think the worst part is customs, departure lounges, checking in and out of hotels, all that kind of transitional stuff. Getting in and out of airports, he said, is actually worse. He thinks the best part of exploring the new cultures is where you can imagine that you can live there. Going down a river in Burma, for example, in a canoe, or into a teak forest with loggers on an elephant back, or traveling around Afghanistan by camel. He said sometimes you're just in another place, going back like a time machine, and you almost feel like you're on another planet, like in Yemen. He said, for me, it's absolutely riveting, engrossing experience that I can't resist. Seeing how we all live our lives a little bit differently is as important as the way you spend your life. You only live once, he said, and you need to be able to see the world and all the beauty and the mystery and the chaos. I feel that's a worthwhile endeavor. So what was his closest call? He said he was in a plane crash in Yugoslavia. He was doing some aerial photography in a small ultralight plane. The pilot somehow lost control. The plane nosedived into a lake in the middle of February. It hit the water. They were upside down. He was pretty sure he wasn't making it out of that. He said, I had my seatbelt on. I couldn't figure out how to take the seatbelt off. I didn't know where I was. I was somehow able to struggle upside down underwater underneath the seatbelt and get out. It was absolutely frightening, and I was able to swim to shore, and then I got picked up by a boat. So I asked him, does he have trouble getting insurance? He said, I always make sure it's paid up. After years of being in the middle of life and death dramas, there is an addiction, he said, that develops where you keep getting drawn into these extremely sharp and pointed moments. When you're dealing with that kind of level, he said it's hard to go back and do an annual report. Everything else seems to be kind of bland and not very satisfying. You're not only dealing with photography and trying to make meaningful pictures that communicate, but there's that survival aspect, trying to do good photography and good journalism, but also trying to survive. There's a satisfaction that one gets when you're able to actually make it through a day. So why does he do it? He said, I think it's a sense of adventure and discovery and exploration, exploring new places that I haven't been before, trying new food, seeing how the Tibetans live, how they practice their religion. To me, it's fascinating to learn about these differences and realize that we're all basically the same. It helps that he's not married and doesn't have any children. He said, I don't see my personal life as a sacrifice. That's really a negative way to think about it, but I never get to the point where I feel like I've done everything. There is something else I know I'm going to do until I drop. So take a vacation. People always ask me where I go on vacation. He said, to take a vacation from what? Now, his love of Afghanistan produced perhaps the most well-known anonymous face of our time, that piercing stare of a young woman peering from this bedraggled cloak. She was an Afghan refugee, and Steve McCurry took her picture for the cover of National Geographic magazine. I actually have the original National Geographic. Somebody gave it to me in one of my lectures. He said, I went into a refugee camp and I was wandering through and I heard voices coming from the tent, and when I looked in, I realized that it was being used as a school for girls. The teacher gave me permission to take some photographs of her class, and I saw this one particular girl who had this kind of haunted look in her eye. So I got permission to photograph her. Her look kind of summed up the horror because her village had just been bombed. All of her relatives had been killed. She had to make this 2-week trek through mountains into a refugee camp. And she had such piercing, penetrating, haunting eyes, which struck me because she looked so frightened, so traumatized, and yet so resilient. He said, I only spent 3 minutes photographing her, and then she quickly ran off to play with her friends. It was one of those cases, he said, where all the elements of the picture came together in a magical way. The light, the background, what she was wearing, her body language, her expression. Her face is dirty, her shawl is ripped and torn and burnt. She had this sort of dignity, however, that perhaps exuded confidence and fortitude. She became one of the world's most famous faces, and yet nobody knew who she was. He said, rarely a day had gone by since I took the photo that there wasn't a phone call or an email or some query about her, and that happened for 17 years. He said, it's astonishing how people connect with that photograph. Now, he said, after the events of September 11th in 2001 and the fall of the Taliban, I went back to National Geographic and asked them to see if we can do a television assignment and see how Afghanistan was faring. But what I really wanted to do was find the Afghan girl before the refugee camp that she had lived in was dismantled. He had gotten word that he was probably going to lose the possibility of finding her. He said her unforgettable green eyes stared at the world on this magazine cover, and for 17 years, I looked at that Afghan girl and I was trying to figure out how to find her. So we learned that the refugees were in Peshawar, Pakistan, where he last saw her, and that area was about to be razed for a housing project. So he went back one last time. He said, if I'm ever going to find her again, this was my opportunity. He went to the camp, he showed her photo to the village elders, who in turn showed it to their friends and contacts. There were a lot of false leads. One man said it was his wife. There was a girl with an uncanny likeness. She claimed she was the famous girl in the photo, and they started getting frustrated after several days. Then their luck turned around, and a man came forward who insisted that the girl had lived next door to him about 10 years earlier. And a couple days later, that same man brought back the girl's brother. This is the brother, her brother, and he introduces him to the girl's husband, and let me go back a little bit, and that's the girl once they found her, the Afghan girl. He said it was a profound and moving experience to go back and actually found her. He said it was amazing. This is the closest I had ever been to her, and it was an absolute miracle to find this little nameless girl out of the literally hundreds of thousands of refugees. Her name was Sharbat, and she was located almost 20 years after that first picture appeared on the cover in 1985, and she had absolutely no idea that she had become an icon. It was also listed in the National Geographic book that came out, the 100 Best Pictures. She was identified through a series of contacts that led everyone to her brother and her husband, and they agreed that if she was willing to be interviewed, they would give permission. She had been photographed only on 2 occasions. At the time that he first photographed her, and then at the reunion. Those are the only 2 times that she had her picture taken. She never saw her famous portrait until she was shown that picture. The face captivated all of the readers of National Geographic and the world. She had no idea that her image was known around the world. But we never knew her story and we didn't know her name. So her name is Sharbat Gula. She lives a traditional Muslim life behind a veil. She was not allowed to meet men outside of her family, but the National Geographic team was given permission to send a female associate producer in to meet Sharbat and photograph her face. When they compared the photographs with the woman and with the girl, they were certain it was the same person because of the irises in the eyes, the moles, and the scars on her face, and it all indicated that it was the same person. But still, to make sure, an explorer team obtained verification through iris scanning technology and face recognition techniques that are used by the FBI. Now, after her family granted permission for her to meet with the man who photographed her, which happened several days later, he knew immediately after so many years that her eyes were exactly the same. He said she remembered me mainly because she had never been photographed before. And she also told him that she remembered that her head covering was full of holes and it had been just scorched by a cooking fire, and she was embarrassed that he was taking a picture of her with a hat on, with her garb on that had holes in it. She remembers that she was angry with him because she knew she would get in trouble because she was being viewed by a man and a stranger. When they met again, McCurry told Sharbat that her image had become as famous as the people, representing the people of Afghanistan, kind of as a symbol. And he said she wasn't particularly interested in her personal fame, but she was very pleased when she said that she had come to become a symbol of dignity and resilience of her people. Now, this original image had seized the imagination of so many people around the world, but mainly because she expressed pain and resilience, strength and beauty all at the same time. When she agreed to have herself photographed by Steve McCurry again, not just the woman, she removed her veil and she was willing to tell her story. She wanted the people around the world to know her face, and more importantly, she wanted them to know that she survived the refugee camp in Pakistan. She was a child when her country was caught in the jaws of the Soviet invasion, and she said a carpet of destruction smothered countless villages like hers. They translated into this. She said she was about 6 when the bombing killed her parents. She said, "The sky bled terror. At night the dead were buried, and the sounds of planes stabbed us with dread. We left Afghanistan because of the fighting. The Russians were everywhere. They were killing people and we had no choice." So shepherded by her grandmother and her brother and their 4 sisters all walked to Pakistan for a week, and they moved through the mountains covered in snow, and they would beg for blankets to keep themselves warm. She said, "You never knew when the planes were going to come, and we had to hide in caves." The journey that began with the loss of her parents, a trek across the mountains by foot, ended in a refugee camp tent, a living situation, living with total strangers. She said it was difficult to live in cramped surroundings with people that you didn't know. There's no privacy. You live at the mercy of other people. She said the Russian invasion destroyed our lives, her brother said. And he said, it's the ongoing tragedy of Afghanistan, invasion, resistance, invasion. Now, during a lull in the fighting in the 1990s, she went home to her village in the foothill mountains that were now veiled in snow, and she lived in this village at the end of a thread path, and she scratched out an existence, nothing more. She planted corn and wheat and rice, walnut trees. There was a stream that spilled down the mountain, except in times of drought. There were no schools, no clinics, no roads, no running water. And here is what her day would look like. She rises before dawn and prays, fetches water from a stream. She cooks, cleans, does laundry, cares for her children. They're the center of her life. Her brother is on the right. Her husband and 2 of her 4 children are with her. She said her 4th daughter died in infancy. She has never known a happy day. And her brother said, "Perhaps maybe the day of your marriage," and she said no. She was married at 14. Her husband was slight in build. He had a smile, Steve McCurry said, like the gleam of a lantern. I'm sorry, she was married at 13, and the match was arranged. Now, he lived in another town. He worked in a bakery. He had to bear the burden of medical bills, and he said the $1 a day that he earns vanishes like smoke. She had asthma. She couldn't tolerate the heat and the pollution in the area where he lived, so he would only spend part of the time with her. The rest of the year she lived in the mountains. She followed the same rituals that most Islamic women followed, that at the age of 13, following puberty, they're married off. She eventually retreats into the black shawl that she had around her face, and she said that if she kept it open any longer, she might evaporate. Her eyes were now starting to get angry with all the questions they were asking. She said, "It's not my custom to subject myself to so many questions by strangers." One last question they asked her. She said, have you ever felt safe? And she said, "No, but life under the Taliban was better. At least there was peace and order." And she had never seen that photograph of the girl. They kept asking her, I don't know why, that she wouldn't have had the opportunity. She said she couldn't write her name. She could not read. She harbors the hope of education for her children. She wanted her daughters to have skills. She wanted them to finish school, but there were no schools there. So the reunion between Steve McCurry and the woman with the green eyes was very quiet. The cultural tradition for married women is very strict. She was not allowed to look and certainly not smile at a man who was not her husband. And she did not smile at McCurry. He said her expression was flat. She did not understand how many people were touched by her photograph. She didn't know the power of her eyes, he said. Now, many photographers try to keep a distance between themselves and the subjects, but McCurry became involved. He said, when you visit a place so many times, you notice what areas really need help. You want to call this to the attention of the world, and you realize that even a nominal effort can be significant. A contribution to a family or a country like Afghanistan, it's a way of thanking everyone in that country, thanking them for so much that they have done for me, how they helped me in my work over the years. So he bought sewing machines for everyone in the little town that she lived in, including her daughters. There was a renewed interest now that she was found again. He felt that that was a chance that he could reach out to others and bring some help to these people who so much needed it. So he created an organization called Imagine Asia, which helps children in rural Asian communities by addressing the fundamental education and healthcare needs of those areas. And they work in partnership with community leaders and local non-government organizations. And they establish primary schools, which also have the added benefit of medical care. They also provide thousands of new textbooks and supplies to the students. They're currently working on providing stipends to ensure the hiring and training of teachers and administrative staff, securing funds necessary for learning materials and supplies and furniture that will help these schools to operate more efficiently. They're partnering with a variety of different provinces in Afghanistan, Tibet, Pakistan, and India, and it's a very big organization. Imagine Asia is dedicated to assisting in the implementation of pilot programs in fields of peace and education, computer literacy, health education, environmental awareness, etc. Now, in 2014, Sharbat Gula was arrested at her residence in the northwest city of Peshawar after more than a year of investigation about her. They raided her house. They had picked up evidence against her, and the officials were also arrested who were involved in helping her and her two sons get Pakistani national identity cards. Now, at this point, one of her children had already died, her young baby. Now, a second child was gone. Her husband had died, and she had two sons. Her third daughter got sick and got well. So she had 3 children, but no husband. And the arrest came as Pakistani authorities were now starting to crack down on Afghans who had illegal national identity cards. And the authorities said that she had illegally obtained a Pakistani identity in 1988 and a computerized identity card in 2014 and still retained her Afghan passport, and she used it to travel to Saudi Arabia. So she winds up going into hiding after they were investigating her, and then they arrested her. She was eventually handed over to Afghan authorities at the border crossing, and she was facing up to 14 years in prison and a fine of somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 if she was convicted. Now, the case grew national attention and criticism of Pakistani authorities over their harsh treatment of Gula and the other Afghans who the Islamabad said were expelled as illegal immigrants. And she was eventually flown to Kabul, where the president there, Ashraf Ghani, and his wife hosted a reception for her, and they handed her the keys to a fully furnished apartment. She captured the heart of millions because she was the symbol of displacement, he said. The enormous beauty, her enormous energy that she projected from her face captured hearts and became one of the most famous photographs that he had ever seen. So he was aware of this photograph and what she represented. He said, "It's a privilege for me to welcome her, and we're proud to see that she lives with dignity now and with security in her homeland." So you can't help but think about Kodachrome and that song. I should really play it at this point. But it became the end of an era. Kodachrome Film, one of the first successful color films in history, was discontinued in 2009. And the last lab to process Kodachrome stopped at the end of 2010, just as Kodak started recognizing that digital cameras were making physical film obsolete. So Steve McCurry was not happy about that. He said, "Imagine leaving digital images in a hard drive, coming back 40 years later. Would anyone be able to read the data?" That's what's the great thing about the film. It's self-contained. You hold the picture up to the light and there it is. But before it was all gone, he had used Kodachrome a substantial amount of time for his work, and he asked if he could have the honor of using the very last roll of Kodachrome, and that's it right there. He took about 36 shots. These are only 3 of them. And it was an event like none other. National Geographic filmed it. You can go online and see a half-hour video of the last photographs taken of Steve McCurry with this Kodachrome film. It's fascinating. And it's also on his website, and it captures the precision, the spontaneity of his work. He wanders through different parts of New York and India. He reveals how he simply observes the world around him. We talk about Steve McCurry and all of his thousands of extraordinary pictures that he's taken over a 40-year career, during which time he has won dozens of awards. He said that, "I believe when you find something that you love, you should do it your whole life. Why would you retire from doing what you love? That's just not what we do." He feels that his purpose and his resolution is to make a positive contribution to the world that he lives in with his camera. He manages to capture beauty and mystery even in the simplest shots. His pictures become, and they truly are, iconic. And they're a lightning rod for real concern and awareness. In effect, he raises an almost abstract question on how much power a picture can have. And these images emphasize the indispensable value of human dignity. There's 2 more pictures that I just couldn't figure out how to throw into the presentation. This is so interesting. This is a celebration called Holi. It's one of the oldest festivals in India, and it's celebrated by people throwing colored powder and water at each other. And each color represents their gift that they give to other people, and it's a representation of their love and what they share. He said, "I look for the unguarded moment, the essential soul peeking out, experience etched on a person's face, and I try to convey what it's like to be that person, a person caught in a broader landscape that you could call the human condition. Capturing the essence of human struggle and joy is what his goal was, and I think he achieved it successfully." That's the story of Steve McCurry. Any questions? Yes?
Where is he now? What's he doing?
He's still taking photographs all over the world.
No, they're digital.
Yeah, he uses digital film. And you know what's really sad is that people are now commenting on his pixelation, the fact that when he takes a picture, he could eliminate something in the background digitally, like all photographers do, to enhance his pictures, and that his true form has been changed. Well, of course it has. It's digital, and it's frustrating, and you see all these issues that are coming up about how he enhances photographs. There's another thing that's been going on now. One of his assistants stole some of his photographs, copied them, reproduced them, and it's about, he thinks, between $4 and $6 million worth of property in a very trusted assistant that worked with him for most of his life. So he's a little frustrated with that, and that's kind of in the news. If you Google Steve McCurry, that's probably the first article that'll come up. Yes, any other questions? Yes.
Did he have a permanent residence somewhere in the States or somewhere?
He went back and visited his family, his parents, until they didn't live there anymore. And I believe that, although there isn't real confirmation, but somewhere in Pennsylvania he owns a home. But he seems to travel more than come home. So I think the world is probably his home. Well, thank you so much. I hope I get to see you again. And enjoy this beautiful snowfall.
Thanks to the management and staff of the Hudson Library and Historical Society for their assistance in the production of this program and for providing the Through the Eyes of the Artist series for the citizens of Hudson. For a DVD or Blu-ray copy of this or any HCTV program, contact Hudson Community Television at 330-653-2500 or via email at hctv@hudson.oh.us.